It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, everybody.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. You'll remember this show for sure.
Oh, yes, and for a lot of reasons. And I'm going to start by telling you that in Florida, coastal flooding is becoming more and more frequent. Severe floods that used to be referred to as 100-year floods are becoming every few year floods. Florida is already seeing the devastation of climate change, and their Republican lawmakers are changing their tune on environmental policy in response. Republican Governor Ron DeSantis even appointed a chief science officer. This may seem like a small change, but in a party that has long shied away from fixing the climate crisis, this is a big step. And our first and only guest today will be another Republican who has also changed his mind on the climate crisis. We will be joined by pollster and wordsmith Frank Luntz. In 2001, Mr. Luntz helped President George W. Bush reframe global warming as the less scary-sounding climate change, which I never knew that's how that came about. And he encouraged Republican leaders to emphasize a lack of scientific certainty around climate change. But since then, Mr. Luntz has changed his mind. He is now working to reframe the climate crisis as a nonpartisan issue and something Republicans care about changing. So we're going to find out whether that's all true or not. As always, we'll take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have some time left over, we'll try to answer some listener questions. But first, let's hear about the importance of language in changing hearts and minds. David?
Frank Luntz has long been a loyal Republican insider. Mr. Luntz made his name by advising Republicans to repackage their policies with language designed to play more on constituents' emotions. For example, telling conservatives to say they oppose the death tax rather than the estate tax. Dr. Luntz helped the Republicans understand the importance of building messages around small business rather than big corporations. He is well known as a pollster and a political commentator. He conducted focus groups for HBO and Vice News before the 2018 elections, and he appears regularly on HBO and Fox News. He served as a consultant to the NBC show The West Wing. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Frank Luntz.
It's an honor to be here. And Ralph, if you're doing something and you invite me, I'm going to show up every time. We don't agree, but I respect all that you have done. I respect all that you have accomplished, and I appreciate being here.
Well, that's a nice beginning, Frank. And I want to tell our listeners that one thing that makes Frank a good interviewee is that he's very forthright. I'll give you an example. Very candid. Even though he's a partisan, linguistic supporter of the Republican Party's message, and he's given suggestions to the Koch brothers, he does not hesitate telling the Democrats what he thinks of their linguistic abilities. So one day, somebody asked Frank, Frank, you created this phrase, the death tax, to replace the normal description of the estate tax. And the Republicans went with it, and even the press picked it up. What would you call it if you were advising the Democratic Party? And you said without hesitation, a billionaire's tax. But unfortunately, the Democrats are too stupefied linguistically to pick up on the language. They're losing, and they have been losing the language battle for years. So this is another one perhaps the listeners don't know about. I think around 2002, when Frank was huddling with some business and political types on the Republican side, he said that the phrase global warming was too frightening and that they should use the word climate change, like fall, winter, spring, summer, something sounds benign. Well, look what happened. The Democrats lapped it up like a cat lapping up milk, and they started using climate change, ignoring my advice and others to use a more descriptive phrase of the devastation that's come and is coming, like climate chaos, climate catastrophe, climate disruption. They're still using your phrase, Frank. So let me ask you this question. Why are the Democrats so bad in using the language, And I want to get specific once I get your general response. I'll give you examples of what I mean.
Actually, this will surprise you. I was in the White House as recently as this past December, and I was very nervous, and I finally got the guts to walk up to the president and ask him, what does the J in Donald J. Trump stand for? Ralph, you know what he told me? Genius. A pause for laughter. I don't. My job is to understand what the public thinks. And I will tell you that there are a lot of people who realize and condemn me, if you follow me on Twitter, for being not a loyal Republican and for questioning whether or not I'm even a Republican at all or a conservative at all. And climate is a great example, and I'm going to give you specificity, and I'm going to launch something with you that I've not talked about. And I will not be talking about for about another 60 days as I complete the project. I am a climate change embracer. I have, for the last 11 years, and people don't realize it, I've been working to bring about legislation to promote and end the policies that are contributing to climate change. And my focus is going to be on the reuse, recycle, and reprocess of paper, plastics, metal, glass, of all the things that we use at home. And I'm working on the messaging of this right now. What do you call it? How do you get people to do it? So that we have a cleaner, safer, healthier world. And that is an example of where the Democrats get it wrong. They keep wanting to talk about sustainability. Problem with sustainability is that it communicates the status quo to a public that desperately wants cleaner lakes, cleaner rivers, cleaner air, that desperately wants to hold corporations accountable for the pollution that they bring to their communities. And so having switched sides, if you would call it that, I'd like to argue that there aren't sides, but now embracing it, I am going to be sitting with Democrats across the country, trying to get them to focus on messaging that is more effective and frankly more efficient than the climate messaging that they've been using over the last 20 years. And Ralph, I'm not optimistic about it because I've been fighting this battle for the last 10 years. And I will tell you that there are a lot of Democrats that would rather be right than elected, that would rather be right than effective, that would just rather say what they want to say and feel good about it than actually move the ball forward, which is something you've done your whole career. But to make you guys feel better, the Republicans are the same way.
You know, you had an epiphany about 10 or 12 years ago. I guess you were woken up in the middle of the night. And what happened that made you rethink your engagement in climate disruption?
I'm going to shock you because this is not somebody you would embrace. This is not someone that any of you in this interview appreciate, but it came from Rupert Murdoch. I had sat with the Environmental Defense Fund twice. 2 times we tried to find a way to work together. Twice. For an hour at a time, we talked about our positions on the environment and what needed to be done at the time. It was split between climate change and global warming. And we could not make it happen. And Murdoch called me at home and said, this matters to me. I think that we are doing serious harm to our surroundings and we need to address it. And I want you to go back one more time and put your biases aside and listen to them and try to learn from them and then try to help them. And the third time was the charm. And we went across the country. We did a number of the dial sessions. That's where people hold a device about the size of a remote control. We did a number of these to try to figure out what the best language was. And it was the EDF, came up with the idea, brilliant idea. Don't argue over the science, argue over the policy and argue over the impact. Arguing over the science doesn't get you the legislation you need. Arguing over the science doesn't get corporations to follow suit. It doesn't do anything for corporate social responsibility. Instead, talk about if there's no climate change, we will still have better technology. If there's no climate change, we will still have cleaner air and cleaner water. If there's no climate change, we will still have more jobs. If there's no climate change, we will still have a positive impact on the people we want to affect. And if there is climate change, we just may save the planet.
Sounds like me 20 years ago, but you also had an experience with these wildfires in 2017 in Southern California. Didn't that make you even more determined?
That made me more public. I'm in that house right now. I'm recovering from a stroke that I had 5 months ago. I was in the bedroom of my home, which is up high, and I could actually see the flames that were less than 2 miles away from my house. I could see the flames themselves, and I could smell the charcoal. I could not figure out what that smell was because my fire alarm had not gone off. And I step outside, and you can see ash coming down. And for about 5, 6 hours, I wondered whether my house would survive. The difference, what that did was I was already working for the advocates of legislation on climate before that. I'd started to do that work in 2009. But what that did in 2017 and 2018, because we had it for 2 years in a row, is it made me go public. And I sat down with a half a dozen Democratic senators in public. I testified before their committee on addressing this, and I'm trying to provide everybody, Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. Ralph, the way that you're going to win in 2020 and beyond is the way that I realized is so important, which is you have to break down partisan barriers. You actually have to get people to listen, learn, and then lead. And they won't hear you if they think you're a partisan. So I'm trying to figure out, because of those fires, because of the things I've experienced, I'm trying to figure out how to make America less partisan. And I will tell you, I am completely failing.
Well, listen, people aren't aware of this. This is a new Frank Luntz to a lot of people. What do you think of George Lakoff? The Democrats often say he's your counterpoint. He's a linguistic professor at University of California, Berkeley, and he likes to give words and phrases that resonate with millions of people to the Democrats and doesn't have much luck. What's your view of his work?
I think his work is very good, but you said it correctly. He approaches this as a partisan issue, and I approach this as a national issue without partisanship. The best language is not language that only appeals to one side. The best language, people say, appeals to everyone. And I'll give you an example. I'm working on something right now for campaign finance reform, which I know that you believe in. And I know that this is a time to actually get Republicans on board, because Democrats are raising more money than Republicans. They raise more dark money. They raise more PAC money. They raise more independent expenditure money, and they're raising more campaign money. They've got more billionaires that are involved in this process. So Republicans would never support campaign finance reform because they always felt that their hands would be tied. Now they have a chance to do it. I assume Democrats still support it because they have for the last 30 years. That just because they're raising more money from rich people that you, Ralph, oppose, they're in the pockets of those people right now. And I got to believe that the activists want campaign finance reform. So we have a unique opportunity for Democrats and Republicans alike to support it. And I'm going to try to get it launched in this campaign cycle. And one more thing. I don't care if people yell at me on the web. My Twitter account, Twitter is such a poisonous environment. I offer ideas. I offer polling data to contribute to the knowledge in the debate. And one of the things that the stroke did is that it just made me not follow the meanness and the partisanship and the ugliness that we have on social media. I continue to engage, to put forward ideas and to explain public opinion.
Let me run some of the words that the Democrats use before we get to you and Trump. They use words that are really almost contraindicated to normal verbal discourse with regular people. Magical thinking, they like that one. Krugman likes that one. That's just another word for lying. They use the word magical thinking. They use the word problematic when they really mean this is something really bad.
By the way,
use the word neoliberal, which was, you may not know this was concocted in the 1930s by Milton Friedman, who wanted to distinguish his hardline pro-free market theories with the liberals in the 19th century, mainly trying to curb government abuse, like our Bill of Rights. And the Democrats adopt neoliberal. I asked these writers, well-known writers, why are you using the word neoliberal? You think anybody other than a fraction of 1% know what that means? That means globalization, corporate power, domination. Instead of using the word sellers to describe drug companies and health insurance companies, they use the word providers. Instead of using corporate crime, they use the word white-collar crime. Why do they do this? Can you explain?
Well, I think the one I liked the best was under the Obama administration, they tried to change the name mustard gas and call it a spicy condiment so that it would have a more genteel feel to it. I don't know. I don't understand why politicians say anything. I really do think that so many of them are so out of touch and they don't understand the voice of the people. But I'll say to everyone who's listening to this show that if you want to be an effective communicator, you actually do have to put aside your own word choices and your own preferences and listen to the public itself. They have a lot to say about what's powerful. You talked about magical thinking. I'm thinking, what is this, a trip to Disney World?
That's
Just,
right.
just
That's right. Let's talk about Trump. You've had your ups and downs with Trump. He said very bad things about you in the past. And now you have, through Mick Mulvaney's new chief of staff, some entry. So I want to read a paragraph from the June 11th Washington Post. Quote, Frank Luntz, a Republican pollster who frequently leads focus groups, said Trump's strident rhetoric about crime the past week's likely to hurt him with the voters he needs to expand his base of support. Quote, and I'm quoting you, he's isolated linguistically, Luntz said, quote, he's talking about, quote, law and order. The last time I heard that was the 1968 campaign. His rhetoric is 50 years old. The world has changed. He's got 40% of the country completely enthralled with him. But this is not a lexicon that gets you elected. This is a lexicon that gets you to 45% and not more, end quote. So what are you telling? Give us some insight here. You've actually met with Trump. He's sort of making up with you, with Mick Mulvaney, putting you together. What do you want to have Trump say in terms of language, since he thinks he's a linguistic genius himself?
Ralph, I don't want to tell him anything. And he doesn't want to hear anything from me either. The only reason why I wanted to meet with him is I really wanted his signature on a couple items that every president since Franklin Roosevelt has signed, going back to 1932, so it's almost 100 years. I know he doesn't like me. I know he doesn't like the words that I use, that he doesn't like the language that I research. I'll give you an example. He defines his supporters as warriors. Nobody wants to be called a warrior other than people in the military or maybe people in the police. His own supporters identify themselves as hardworking taxpayers, and yet he talks about them as warriors. Another example is that he was so effective when he talked about, I will be your voice. It was the single best line of 2016. The voters who felt that they'd been ignored or forgotten. I will be your voice. He said it at the convention. Now he talks about the silent majority. The problem with Donald Trump's communication is that it's all about Donald Trump. And his people don't have the guts to tell him, sir, you're doing yourself damage. And I've just lost interest in arguing with people. It's part of the change over the last 5 or 6 months. If he doesn't want to hear it, if he wants to talk about his own accomplishments, fine, let him do it. That is not what voters want to hear. And it's the reason why Biden is now up 10 or 11 points. And by the way, one last point. Hiring a pollster to discredit another pollster is pathetic. Trying to buy a pollster to undermine the fact that you are going further and further down in the polls just tells you that you're going to go even further down. And that's what Trump did. And that should say everything about what's going on in this campaign. But there is a but. I know I talk too much. This is also an impact of the last 5 months.
Well, listen, someone asked me when I told them we're going to be interviewing you, Frank. We're talking with Frank Luntz, the wordsmith, the pollster, the advisor to politicians. They said, ask him about the nicknames. Now, Trump has nicknamed hundreds of people. We've heard some of them, Crooked Hillary, Lying Ted Cruz. But he's also nicknamed people most people have never heard of, a person running for Congress in Western Pennsylvania. And the nicknames are very, very pejorative, which some people think demeans the office of the presidency. However, a high official in his campaign for re-election said recently that the nicknames work. And one of the reasons they work is because the Democrats do not give him nicknames. You know, one way to deal with a bully is to give him his own medicine. And they refuse to give him nicknames, even though the press routinely reports all these nicknames against A, B, C, D people and never gives these people a right of reply. So it's one thing if you just gave a nickname and the press ignored it, but nicknames becomes mass media, even the New York Times and Washington Post. Give us your view on nicknames. Should the Democrats give him nicknames?
Well, he calls me Fat Frank. And because of that, because I was so hurt over the last 16 weeks, I've lost 60 pounds. I'm literally only half the man I used to be. So he's going to have to come up with a new nickname for me, maybe Loser Luntz or something like that. I don't ascribe to that. I don't engage in that. That's not my style of communication, and I think it's awful. And I don't want the Democrats to do it back to him, because what my mom taught me is if everyone else is jumping off a bridge, would you jump off the bridge? And I said, well, if they're having fun and they want to get into the water, why not? And my mom then would hit me. Ralph, can we chill out a little bit about our politics? Can we treat each other with just a little bit of respect and stop ripping the hell out of each other? I know that Mr. Feldman really wants the Democrats to be like the Republicans, that aggressive. I don't like it. It's not good for the country. And we can see the damage that he's done over the last 3.5 years.
But ethically, you make a good point. Ethically, the question is it effective for him? He's now called Joe Biden Sleepy Joe, and that's been published in all the press dutifully. Biden, of course, is not responding. But just apart from the ethics, it's one thing if the press didn't report all this. You could ignore it and not go to his level, down to his level. But what about just as a matter of electoral tactics?
As electoral tactics, I think the best example for this failing is the fact that on average, Trump is now losing by 10 points, and that number is increasing by 0.5 percentage point a week. That the less Biden speaks, the better he does. The more that Donald Trump speaks, the worse that he does. If I could wave a magic wand, and if you said to me, Frank, you're now in charge of the Trump campaign, I'd send him to Mar-a-Lago for 2 weeks. I would just get him out and make him quiet. If you want to get into the electoral part of this, there's only 6% of Americans that are truly undecided. That's it. And they are undecided not because of what Trump has done, but because of what Trump says. They're undecided because they don't have an opinion on issues, or else they would have chosen between Biden and Trump. They're looking at the attributes of the candidates. They're nervous that Joe Biden is too old. They're concerned that Donald Trump is off the rails, and they don't like either of them. So in the end, you win the election. If you're trying to actually win the election, you have to do it by saying what you mean, meaning what you say, which is the number one way to communicate honesty. A strong leader in times of crisis. And Donald Trump is not doing well on that. And the third thing would be empathy. And Donald Trump, the feeling is that he's not handled COVID well, and he's not handled the protests well, but that he has handled the economy well, and they have more faith in him on China than they do with Biden.
Let me just interrupt you here just a minute, because you mentioned the COVID. There are some Republicans in the Congress who agree with a growing coalition that's demanding that Trump and Pence step aside and let professional scientists and managers deal with the COVID-19, because every time Trump opens his mouth, they are sinking in the polls, the Republicans, not just Trump. If you were advising Trump, would you say, look, do what New Zealand, Taiwan, British Columbia, put professional managers and scientists who know about epidemics and pandemics in charge and step aside? What would you say to him?
I couldn't do that because he's not going to. He gave Mike Pence responsibility to handle this challenge and then took it back from him in a matter of days after Pence was actually getting reasonably good marks from the media.
But apart from your prejudgment as to his response, what do you think he should do? Step aside in favor of the scientists? Because, more and more people are dying because he's bungling, he's not coordinating the states, he's lying about the trends, he's recommending dangerous drugs. He's making a lot of things worse. He started late. He started 2-3 weeks earlier, according to a Columbia University study, because of the multiplier effect, could have prevented over 80% of the deaths. What would you advise him to do, regardless of his obstinacy?
Well, I do want him because I think we're all complicit in this, literally all of us. I believe that it was the mayor of New York who told people to continue to go out, continue to go to the pubs, continue to go to the bars, celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and that precipitated a huge outbreak in the city. And you would think that the mayor of New York would know better than this. I have an issue. I gave Andrew Cuomo props because of his briefings. But the fact is, New York and Westchester County and the other suburbs were devastated by COVID. Now, what he ended up doing turned out to have been smart and effective, but he didn't start early enough in New York. And that's why the death rate was so high in that state. And the same thing in New Jersey. I don't think anyone has done this well, but I agree with you, Ralph. I agree with you that medical professionals, medical experts should be devising the plans. And then the elected officials have the responsibility for implementing them. I think it's a team approach. And you also need to get input from the business community. I think we're all in this together. We all suffer together. We all benefit together. And I don't like it as us versus them. There's way too much of that in society today. I think we all have a role to play.
No doubt. People have to have more discipline. Some governors and mayors have been better than others, smarter than others. But he's the president. I mean, he's got the command of the federal response, the federal resources, the federal preemptions. And do you think the way he's behaving since February on this COVID-19, he's hurting his electoral prospects?
I think it is hurting his electoral prospects. And I think it's one of the reasons why he's pushing for everything to reopen. And what I'd be saying to him, and what I say to everyone, because what I'm saying on your radio show is exactly the same that I'd be saying if I were sitting in the office of Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump. The public is not demanding things reopen. They want a safe and sensible and responsible process. And I use those three words deliberately because those are the three words that the public is looking for. They do want to resume their lives. And it's not about reopening the economy. It's about doing it on an individual basis. Ralph, you were most successful when you personalized the challenge in the automotive industry, when people realized that the cars were so-called unsafe at any speed. When people saw themselves and what corporations were doing, and they saw that they were getting hurt by it on an individual personal basis, they demanded change. But if you just talk about the system, the economy, if you globalize it or nationalize it, it's too big.
Frank, you make an important point. Semanticists call this going down the abstraction ladder. So if you go where people live, work, and raise their families, you get a lot of conservative liberal support around all kinds of things, not just health insurance and living wage, but even criminal justice reform. That's getting down to where they live, work, and raise their families. So that's the point you're making. So what would you advise the Democrats and the Republicans to push for before November for the election? What would you advise them to do on voter suppression issues and economic issues? Because I'm not asking you to advise a Democrat partisan or Republican partisan. What do you think they should put 5 or 6 things before the American people?
I think that they need to talk about genuine reform. And reform may not be the word anymore. And in fact, I actually think that it isn't the word anymore. But they have to show the specific changes that they would make and the changes that they would make within the first 100 days. Second is that there are some things that Trump has done that they specifically oppose. Give 3 examples to the public. These are the 3 things that I would overturn if you give us the power to do it. Third is our deteriorating relationship on a global scale. I'm not suggesting that Biden return to a Hillary Clinton foreign policy because I think a lot of Democrats will oppose it. But I do think that Trump has talked about American influence in the world stage, and Biden does know foreign policy. He was with the Foreign Relations Committee. He's got an expertise, and I would suggest that he raise it. And then fourth, I know that there are people like Tom Friedman who don't want Biden to debate. You cannot do that. What good is winning an election if you are handed a country that is destroyed? And I do believe we're in the process of destroying ourselves right now, that Biden can use those debates and say, look, these are the things I will do in the first 24 hours, in the first 100 days, and in the first year. And this is the impact that it will have. He has to be side by side with Trump and challenge him. If he does that, and he does it well, and he completes a sentence, if he completes a sentence, he's going to win based on the language that Trump is using. But at a certain point, you cannot just run away. You cannot just hide in a basement. You have to engage. This is America. This is the most important presidential election, arguably since 1968. He has to speak up and speak out and tell us what he's going to do. And by the way, if he does, and if he wins, that gives him his moral push to make the changes he wants to make, because then he can say, look, I was clear about it. This is my agenda. This is what I was going to do. And if he doesn't do it, and he simply depends on Trump imploding because of awful language that Trump is using, then there will be people who will rightfully say, I didn't vote for Joe Biden. I voted against Donald Trump, and I don't support what Biden is trying to do.
On your global issue, if you'd be a little more specific, what would you say about these wars of empire? You know, he's pursuing 9 illegal wars inherited from Bush and Obama, many of them. What would you say, let's say the Israeli-Palestinian issue, what would you say to Biden, what he should do compared to go for Trump's message to Netanyahu, take part of the West Bank, do whatever you want?
I believe in normalization, not annexation. I believe in recognition, not annexation. I believe that you seek what now is offered, which is to engage with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Saudis and the Emiratis, that the Middle East is not the same country, not the same region today that it was even 20 years ago, that you may not be able to achieve peace, but you do have the ability for people to recognize each other and at least live together side by side and not kill each other.
You're talking about a two-state solution?
Absolutely. I think it can be done. And I think that the Palestinians could be under significant pressure, not the people. The people, frankly, have been screwed by their leaders. That you've got a Palestinian Authority that's weak and corrupt, and you have a Hamas leadership that is dangerous and done real damage to the people that they claim to represent. And if they had elected a different government in Israel over the last 3-4 months, you would have had a different outcome. You can get a peace agreement, but you got to move quickly, because times like this, Anwar Sadat came once, and fortunately, they were able to take advantage of it. King Hussein came once, and they were able to take advantage of it. I think the leaders you have in the Emirates are incredible, and they can help everyone in the region if they are not just talking to each other, but have normalized relations with each other. And that can happen, but it's not going to happen under annexation.
And it's not going to happen, I suppose you mean under Netanyahu. I mean, they occupy the West Bank, they take the water, they blockade Gaza. They don't seem to take advantage of their military superiority to take the lead. That's when you want to take the lead.
I don't agree with your characterization. I've spent a lot of time in the region, and I see the violence that still goes on. I see the terrorism that still goes on. And there's a narrative on both sides of this, and this is part of what I'm trying to achieve.
I don't want to, from your own assumption, Frank. The people who are dominant.
Rob, I don't
in a
want
great position to take the lead. The people who are dominant, and by the way, the innocent casualties are 400 to 1. 400 Palestinians killed and injured for one innocent.
So when you say
Israeli area, so you always want to go. Who can really make it happen is who's dominant, right? Isn't that simple politics?
I believe that simple human behavior, if you sell yourself as a victim, you'll never find the solution. If you sell yourself as a victim, you will always blame someone else rather than seeing within yourself and your own capabilities the chance to resolve and make a difference. I do believe that there are victims. I believe there are victims in this country. I believe there are victims. I believe the Palestinians are victims. I believe they're victims of their own leadership. They're victims of Hamas. They're victims of Fatah. They deserve a homeland of their own. If you want me to be explicit, I will do so on your show. Palestinian people deserve a homeland of their own. They don't deserve the crap that they've gotten from their own leaders. And I teach at NYU Abu Dhabi. So I actually am in the Middle East every year. And one of the things I want to do is I want to teach. I met with the King of Jordan. We talked about this, that the young Palestinians have been radicalized, that they don't want to make peace with Israel. They don't believe Israel should exist. Israel's not going anywhere. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. So let's figure out some formula that's good enough that everyone gives so they will get that much more. And don't play the victim card.
Well, of course, this collaboration at the village level between Israeli pro-peace and Palestinian pro-peace is a good start, by the way. I'm sure you're familiar with
Yeah, but you know what happened? But Ralph, you know what happened in Gaza? You had Palestinian peace activists communicating with Israeli peace activists at the beginning of COVID, and they were turned in by some left-wing so-called peace organization, and they put 6 of the Palestinians in jail for collaborating with Israel. Cut it out.
The same thing has happened, when they try to do nonviolent resistance to Palestinians. The Israelis arrested people in that way and blocked them, wouldn't even let them in the country. Anyway, listen, this is covering a lot of ground. I want to get Steve and David in on this.
Yep.
Because they're brimming with questions and comments, I'm sure.
Well, I have a question, Frank, about morality, because getting advice from a Republican on how to frame the conversation, you're suggesting more obfuscation, more playing with language, while the Republican sees the moral high ground. That's what they're good at. Why don't the Democrats unite and seize the moral high ground on Medicare for all, on climate change, and make it a moral imperative, almost religion, almost seizing religion? Why don't we do that?
I don't know. The key in all of this.
Would you advise something black and white, plain spoken black and white morality, as opposed to manipulating language?
The more honest you are, the more likely you are to succeed. The more direct and clear you are, the more likely you are to succeed. And the more that you play with what I would call weasel words, the worse that it gets. Now, there's an exception to that. Bernie Sanders does not represent a majority of America. I know you guys have a warm spot in your heart for him. That is too extreme for too many people. And that's why he didn't win the Democratic nomination. He wasn't even trying to get a majority of the country. He was just trying to get a majority of Democrats. And he failed because the public.
So let me ask the question again. Let me ask the question again in terms of framing. Medicare for all is a moral issue. Climate change is a moral issue. So when you suggest that the Democrats adopt your wordplay and say, hey, forget morality, this is how Republicans talk. There's something in it for you, America, jobs, economic growth, as opposed to something that's black and white, morality, something that Ronald Reagan, a Republican, and George W. Bush, a Republican, they would bottom line this and say this is a moral issue. Why do the Republicans seize the moral high ground and the Democrats don't? Medicare for all is a moral issue.
You can say it. By the way, you can say it as often as you want. That doesn't make it true, and it doesn't make the public believe it. And actually, I've always...
The Republicans have convinced Americans that austerity is a moral issue.
No, they haven't.
They haven't. Puritanical work ethic, personal responsibility. You guys have seized the moral high ground by preaching personal responsibility. It's biblical. Why don't the Democrats seize the moral high ground? Instead of playing with words, why don't they work the moral?
David, you're going to ask the question 8 times. You've phrased it 5. You can do it 3 more, and it doesn't change. You have to understand what the public wants. You have to understand what the public needs and what the public deserves. And that's been a context that I've been exploring now for the last couple of years. But it's based on public opinion. It's based on what they prioritize. So you said Medicare for all. The public does not want government control of health care. Health care is no, they don't.
Yes, they do. Yes,
they don't. It's okay, but
right, I'm going to back off.
Yeah, you have to because you're not a pollster.
No, I'm being polite. I'm going to back off because I'm being polite.
You don't have to be polite, but you're not a pollster. And I just finished a study on it, and actually, I wanted to sit. I was supposed to go back to Washington next week and sit down with a half dozen Democratic senators to show them where the public stands.
But it doesn't matter what the public wants. This is leadership.
You just said it all. You just said it all, David.
Real leadership is telling the people what they want and what they need and what's good for them.
Thank you. That's what they do in Russia and China. That's really good. Real
But
leadership. And
I'm,
that's great. I
I want
love this.
I want to jump in here because you talked about what the public wants, and we have talked many times on this show. And you're a pollster, so you know the ins and outs of how to frame questions. That when you speak about the issues, we are not as divided as we think we are. There are majorities who want Medicare for all, depending on how it's phrased. There are majorities who want gun control. There are majorities who are against the surveillance state. And I'm sure Ralph could name a dozen other topics where there are right-left majorities. And
living wage, cracking down on corporate crime.
exactly. So the idea that America doesn't want something like Medicare for all and Bernie Sanders doesn't represent all of America, what we saw on this show was plutocrats don't want that.
Right.
And plutocrats want Joe Biden. And they were able to marshal their power. It's a minority power to make that happen. Where
Within the Democratic Party.
Within the Democratic Party, yeah. But even without the Democratic Party, there are majority opinions on a lot of these issues. So that's what I take issue with, is that America is not, first of all, is so divided, because there really aren't.
They are. And you can see it in the streets. You can see it in the protests. You can see it over the last 4 weeks how divided we are.
But
we're more
divided by a minority. It's divided
People
by minorities. You said it yourself. Trump is supported by 40%. That means 60% don't. And you could probably project other issues from those numbers too. So 60-40 that's a pretty big majority.
Let me change the subject. What do you think of all this voter obstacles?
I think
call it voter suppression. What do you think?
Everyone has the right to vote. And I think that we should be ensuring that everyone participates.
And what do you think should be done? Because the Republicans have other views on this.
Vote by mail. I think we got to figure out a way that people can vote and protect the system, but vote via the internet, via technology. I think we maintain vote in person that we do. The more people who participate, the more they feel bought into the system. The less people who participate, the more they feel shunned by the system.
Frank, is it permissible to ask who you would like to see win in November?
It's permissible, but I want to go back to David Feldman because I want him to talk about his moral case for Medicare for all. I'm going to see how many times he can say the same words again and again in 1 hour on your show.
But that's what politicians do. They repeat. You know.
Okay, then David's a great writer. Then David's a great politician.
But Frank, when you frame healthcare as a government takeover, and I think that's a phrase that you've advised.
That's correct.
That's just wrong.
It
It's
isn't,
not a government
but
takeover when you talk about what the actual thing is.
You know how I know it was a takeover? Because I lost my own health care. And the problem was I traveled so much, I didn't even know it. I was uninsured for 6 weeks. That I was a USAA healthcare recipient, and I lost it under Obamacare. They could not continue to offer it.
Right,
And
we're not talking about Obamacare. We're talking about Medicare for all, which is just government health insurance like they have in Canada. It is not a government takeover. As Ralph has said thousands of times on this show, privately delivered, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital. That's what that is. So when you say what it actually is, there are majorities who support that. When you call it a government takeover, then of course people are not going to like that because that sounds totalitarian.
And it denies me my choice. I was promised by Barack Obama 3 things.
You
He
had a
actually-
choice, and you didn't have personal responsibility.
He gave me
you
3
didn't
promises.
Health care because you
Guys.
were personally irresponsible, Frank.
Guys, this is amazing.
You lost it.
We're all critical of Obamacare, Frank.
Right.
Obamacare is not single payer, full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out.
Right.
Did you want to answer the question, who would you like to see win in November?
There are aspects of Joe Biden, particularly who he is as a person. I taught his son, Bo, who is one of my best students ever. I have been to Joe's house probably more than all 3 of you combined.
No.
I like Joe very much as a person, but I don't agree with some of the things that he stands for. And I'm waiting to see who he chooses as vice president. I'm still closer to the politics of the Republican Party, even if I don't agree with what the president says or how he says it. And so I'm watching, and I'll attend a few of the rallies. I'll listen to some of the speeches. I've actually attended both. I'm the only human being you've met who has attended both a Biden fundraiser and a Trump fundraiser in 2020.
So do you think Trump for a second term is going to be better for America than a Biden term? You know both sides?
I want to see them debate. I want to see what happens. I want to see what they say.
You think Trump wants to debate?
I'm sure Trump wants to debate, and I'm sure that Biden does not want to debate. But I think that they have to do it. I don't think that Trump's idea of having 4 or 5 debates, I don't think it's necessary. I think we'll see it in the 3 that they're supposed to do. And there's no reason not to. They can even do it the way you and I are doing this radio program right now, which is I call in. They can do a Zoom call side by side where we get to hear what they both have to say. I think that the country is more important than any individual political campaign. I think that we have a right to hold this president accountable for what he has done. I think we have the right to hold the former vice president accountable for what he says. And I don't think that we have determined yet who is going to be the next president. Although I'll tell you right now, and we tape this on the 8th of July, 2020, right now, Joe Biden has the advantage.
Well, I think all of us will agree that they should debate. Not to debate draws very bad conclusions for the faith of the American people in open point-counterpoint type presentations by people who want the most powerful office in the country. Well, we're out of time, Frank. Do you have a book that you've written that you'd like to bring to the attention of our listeners?
The best book I've written, and then I'm going to ask you a question that you're not going to answer now, but that'll give me a reason for you guys to have me back if you're not really angry at me for challenging you all.
Nobody's angry, Frank.
I can imagine that I just irritated at least one of the 3 of you. I wrote a book called Win, and it's all about the language of business and the language of politics. It's the 3rd book that I wrote, and it actually went the highest. It got to number 3 in the New York Times bestseller list, and it's the best thing that I've got in terms of language and messaging. Ralph, I do want to know, I remember when...
Wait, say the title of the book clearly.
Win, W-I-N. And here's what's really bad. I don't even remember the subtitle.
Okay, the book is Win by Frank Luntz. It's probably worth reading regardless of your political predilections.
Ralph, before you dump me, can you say that again without using the word probably?
Oh, you mean, all right. The book is Win by Frank Luntz. I'd read it. You should read it.
Oh, I like the way you said it the first time.
And I'd like to offer my services to the Democratic Party. I can do for the Democrats exactly what Frank Luntz does for the Republicans. I will teach you to advocate for the distinction between right and wrong and good and bad behavior. The Democrats can win on morality because as much as Frank teaches the Republicans, hang on, you don't give it away for free. You preach the language, the manipulation of words. But when you get alone with the Republicans, you're teaching them to campaign on the distinction between right and wrong and good and bad behavior. The Republicans win by seizing the moral high ground. That's the stuff you charge for. The stuff you're saying right now is you're giving this away for free, manipulating language. The truth is, if the Democratic Party ran on morality, on the distinction between right and wrong, good and bad behavior, we would mop the floor with the Republicans.
Here we go again.
Well, I take that as praise for your approach, Frank.
No, it's just, I'm going to make a pitch for Democrats to hire David as well.
Let me break in here. You know, the news is full of this letter by Harper's with over 100 people who never signed letters together. David Brooks, Noam Chomsky, calling for more freedom of speech and less stifling of speech. And you remember Anthony Lewis, who was a columnist for the New York Times for years. His last book was on the First Amendment, and it was titled Freedom for the Thought You Hate. Would you agree with that?
I love that. And I see it all the time at universities where you'll go to a political science department and the students and the faculty will be trying to shut down the only right of center viewpoint among that faculty member. The people that I appreciate the most, and that this is what I try to pattern myself after are those who I disagree with, but they welcome my speech. They welcome my point of view. The fact that you gave me a chance to be heard tells me that you're one of those people, Ralph. One of the people who has your clearly defined point of view, but you're not trying to silence those who disagree with you. And that's one of the reasons why I respect
the
you.
only real believers in the First Amendment have got to believe in giving people they disagree with an opportunity to speak, petition, and assemble. All three in the First Amendment. Well, we're out of time, Frank. We've been talking with Frank Luntz, author of the book Win, and advisor to all kinds of people and groups. And those of you who want to comment, send us your questions so we can follow up the discussion. And maybe we could have you back before the election again, Frank.
Let's do it, but I want to do it in studio with you and me in the same room.
That means no COVID-19, right?
And it also means 6 feet away.
Okay, thanks very much, Frank.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Feel
Thanks,
better.
Frank.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
We have been speaking with Republican wordsmith Frank Luntz. We will link to his website at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we're going to do some listener questions. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 10, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A new compilation of regulatory enforcement actions shows that states have collected more than $17 billion in penalties from financial services companies over the past 2 decades. Most of that sum comes from cases brought by New York State against major U.S. and foreign banks. The data was collected as part of the latest expansion of Violation Tracker, a database produced by the corporate research project of Good Jobs First. The role of state regulators has become more important than ever, given the weakening of enforcement at the federal level, said Good Jobs First Research Director Philip Matera. Good Jobs First collected data on 15,000 successful cases brought by state banking, consumer finance, securities, and insurance regulatory agencies over the past 2 decades. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. All right, let's do some listener questions. I'll take the first one. This is from Martin Smith. And Martin says, I was listening to your podcast this week and your take on voter complacency. And I think you've got it wrong. Americans aren't sitting at home because they don't want to participate. Most Americans are scared. Scared of what, you may ask? We're scared of each other. Why do you think gun sales are so prolific in this country? People aren't arming themselves against the government. They are arming themselves against each other. Other than the occasional hello, I barely speak to my Latino neighbors. We don't socialize, and though I support most immigration causes and have even gone as far as donating money, I would never think of socializing with them. I've even gone as far as timing when I'm on my lawn to avoid running into them. This is what our country has become, a nation of locked doors and rifles on the other side. And you want me, a 300-pound black man, to go around knocking on the doors of my redneck neighbors, trying to convince them to vote for Bernie Sanders? Forget it. Till we overcome our fear and mistrust of one another, our country is in big, big trouble.
Well, my response, Martin, is that one way to overcome mistrust of one another is to collaborate with people, maybe on less controversial issues, to begin with, in the neighborhood and community. You might want to collaborate on anything dealing with education or food scarcity or repair of public services, where it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, you want the same thing. And that's my first response. My second response is there are a lot of areas where people live where they're not so scared. And I've often said, if we just have 1% of the people in congressional districts pressing Congress to behave on behalf of the people, and they have a majority of public opinion beyond them, you don't need much more than that. And history is full of examples where a tiny number of people made all the difference because they knew what they were talking about and they had public opinion behind them. They overcame forces against them who basically were representing a very tiny slice of plutocratic opinion in the country.
All right. Thank you for that question, Martin. David?
This next one is for Ralph, Stephen, David. I live in Canada. This one is from Jerry Chidiak, and the subject is the Canadian healthcare system. He says, Dear Ralph, Stephen, David, I live in Canada and would like to clarify something about our healthcare system. Some debate took place during the wrap-up of your most recent show regarding those Americans who already have a good healthcare plan not being willing to move to a public health care system. The truth is that in Canada, we still have privatized health care. In essence, we have a two-tiered system. I'm not saying it is a good thing. In fact, it's a frequent topic of political debate, but it exists. In essence, everyone in Canada gets excellent health care, but it does not cover things like eyeglasses or prescription drugs. My employer, for example, has a contract with a private health care provider, which I pay into, that then covers a certain percentage of these additional expenses for me and my family. The point is, those with Cadillac plans do not have to worry about losing what they have. We have Cadillacs in Canada too. Thank you for your amazing show.
Well, thank you for listening from Prince George, British Columbia, Jerry. One point I understand is the elderly in Canada do have coverage for prescription drugs. And so that's one exception. The other is of course, that Canada has more control over drug prices. They're still high, but nowhere near as high as the uncontrolled, off-the-wall drug prices in the U.S. And then the third is the point you made. Everybody is in and can go to any doctor or hospital and get coverage just showing their Medicare card from when they're born for the rest of their lives. And you point to an interesting point, and Stephen David, you should know this. There are corporations in Canada and sometimes with U.S. corporate backing that want to keep peeling off some items of coverage under Canadian Medicare and corporatizing them. In other words, making Canadians pay for them separately, like eyeglass. And I don't believe dental care is covered under Medicare, but prices are restrained more in Canada than they are in the United States. So Canadians have to be constantly vigilant because there are commercial forces that are trying to propel Canadian Medicare out of its universal, accessible, affordable state into the private market system.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest, Frank Luntz, again. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our intern is Michaela Squire. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome back Dr. Michael Carome to talk about whether or not Trump and Pence should allow public health experts to take over. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Listeners, talk is cheap. Everybody on this show is a volunteer. It's time for you to start these Congress watchdog groups. Go to ratsreformcongress.org to see how it can be done and how much easier than you think can be your effort on your two senators and representatives.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where Ralph, David, and Steve discuss cancel culture, and Ralph answers more listener questions. First, cancel culture.
A few days ago, an open letter was released, signed by notable people such as J.K. Rowling, David Brooks, and Noam Chomsky. It calls for an end to cancel culture. The letter says that cancel culture stops open debate and free speech, but is taking away powerful people's platform to say racist, sexist, transphobic things, infringing on their free speech, or elevating people's voices who were previously silenced. We're going to debate this, but before we do, I think it's important to agree on a definition. And I looked up the phrase, and this is what I found. Cancel culture. Cancel culture refers to the popular practice of withdrawing support for public figures and companies after they've done or said something considered objectionable or offensive. Cancel culture is generally discussed as being performed on social media in the form of group shaming. Now, Ralph, would you agree with that definition?
I think it goes much further than that. It demands the ouster. It demands the ouster of professors who happen to dissent in a very civil way from universities, from Yale to Evergreen College. It means the ouster of politicians, the ouster of corporate executives, it goes beyond shaming. Shaming is a way of using the First Amendment. There's nothing wrong with shaming. There's nothing wrong with withdrawing and not attending certain public presentations, sort of like a personal boycott. But it goes much further than that. And my concern with all this is, when was the last time you saw a demand for a corporate CEO to quit because the corporate crimes that are committed under this CEO? But you've seen CEOs, including the head of CBS, who have to leave because they engaged in bigoted language and misogynist activity in the workplace. It's okay. Never mind. You can leave for that. You can push people out for that. But what about really serious crimes that take people's lives, produce disease, injury, steal money from consumers? There's no cancel culture penalty for that. The demands of people who engage in cancel culture have got to be higher, bigger, deeper. Donald Trump has canceled the U.S. Constitution, and the Democrats find only one count, the Ukraine affair, to impeach him on, and leave 11 others that are devastating effect on our democracy, our health, safety, economic well-being, freedom of speech, freedom to gather together and organize unions and other associations. And where is the cancel culture retribution there?
But Ralph, we're talking the popular usage right now is what we talked about in the beginning of the show, which is Confederate statues it's being used by Donald Trump and his family, calling cancel culture as this kind of right-wing trope for things that bigoted, racist things they want to engage in. That's what it's being used for now. I mean, I understand what you're talking about. You're arguing for a different kind of cancel culture with a different set of criteria. But what's being talked about now and is in the zeitgeist, and was what one of the things that letter talked about was, it's somehow stifling free speech.
Yeah, I'm defining it much broader than your definition, because I want to raise people's expectations about what David said is right and wrong on a big level of impact for all the people. And that is indiscriminate injustice. All the people suffer, not just going after discriminatory injustice. But on the issue of free speech here, we have the example of Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue produced 6,000 shows before huge audiences. His last one was in 1996. And a lot of shows were simple entertainment. But other shows, he would put on people who violently disagreed with him. He would put on people who vigorously disagreed with him, like the Reverend Jerry Falwell. You couldn't have two people further apart in terms of their views. And what does Phil do? He puts Jerry Falwell on 30 times over a period of years, because he believed that if we have a First Amendment, it must mean to give people you disagree with a platform. And Phil Donahue had the platform. Now just think how distant we are from that philosophy. Just think how intolerant we are from that philosophy, whether it's from the right, the left, middle, whatever it is. There's a massive intolerance not to hear any views you disagree with, so you can rebut them. There's a massive intolerance to the thesis that if you don't like the free speech you're hearing, the answer is more free speech from your side to connect and rebut. You don't stifle someone else's free speech that you disagree with, because someday that's going to come back to bite you when someone else is in charge of deciding who can speak freely. And that's why I like Tony Lewis's book title, which is Freedom for the Thought You Hate.
But what about the idea of raising racist, bigoted speech, giving it a platform that it doesn't really deserve, doesn't really represent?
It depends on the platform. If it's private property, the way Facebook thinks it is, they think they can do whatever they want, even though they have a huge monopoly of users of that service, including their subsidiaries, of course. It all depends on who owns the terrain. The telephone company does not censor speech when you get on the telephone. Presumably, they don't even know what you're saying, although sometimes they're recording it and allowing wiretappers to record it. So it depends where it is. If a Confederate statue applauding a slave owner who committed treason against the United States during the Civil War to protect and perpetuate slavery is on public property, then that's a very open opportunity to replace the statute. And by the way, why do these statutes don't have a statute of limitations? I mean, let's say they have certain statutes, but times have changed. New heroes have emerged. There aren't that much space in cities for statutes on people on horses and so forth. And you just say, okay, you've had 70 years of this general or admiral. We're going to put some more contemporary figures on, or some figures who have been excluded from the past because of bigotry and prejudice.
But that's what the right wing is calling cancel culture, is taking down those Confederate statues.
Well, obviously, that has a different meaning to them than it does to me.
David?
Well, I was saying you can just change the name on the plinth of these statues because they were all manufactured by a company in Massachusetts. During the Jim Crow years, there was a company making these statues. But I think cancel culture is a straw man. I don't think it exists. I think that we're not seeing people getting canceled. Jimmy Fallon wore blackface. He apologizes. Jimmy Kimmel wore blackface. He apologizes. Louis C.K., who maybe did something criminal, has found a home in comedy clubs. He can still tour. In corporate America, what they're worried about is boycotts. That's what they're afraid of. So I'm for boycotts. I think that's the only arrow left in our quiver. So I'm all for cancel culture because I don't think it actually exists.
Steve, who coined cancel culture and when did it become a phrase in currency?
That I don't know. I just know
it's a right wing. It's a new term, and it started recently. It's a meme on social media, and the idea of groupthink, people on social media ganging up on a celebrity for saying something that the group disagrees with. But the cancel culture comes out of the Me Too movement, where women had to hold kangaroo courts on Facebook to identify sexual predators because they weren't being arrested by the police. So a lot of men found the cancel culture an infringement of their rights to due process because women were using the Facebook grapevine to say, stay away from this guy. He's a sexual predator. So it predates the Me Too movement when women had to resort to social media to warn other women about men. It's very useful and valuable. Yeah, there's some collateral damage, but I think the good of cancel culture far outweighs the bad because you don't have, as you pointed out, Ralph, you don't have a justice department. You don't have police enforcing the law.
Well, it comes down to this point, David. Free speech under cancel culture should not be censored. The question when it goes over free speech into demanding ousters of people. So then it becomes an issue of policy, of action. And so what's the response to that when it goes beyond free speech?
I would like to know what the examples are. That letter in Harper's talked generally about that, but
I just don't see anybody getting canceled.
That's right. What are the real examples of that? And Frank Luntz said that he's, had minority opinions, or his professors have, and they get shunned or something. I don't even know what that means. They lose their jobs. People gang up on them. They pick on them.
Yeah, they're driven out. Like professors have been driven out from the Trinity College, from Yale University, from Evergreen, for the most modest dissent on issues that were viewed politically correct. So there are quite a few examples of that. And that's true in the business world, and it's true in some elected officials as well.
I'd like to see those lists.
Yeah, I
think
know.
It's much less than we think.
There was Ward Churchill, who was, I believe, he was fired for saying the chickens came home to roost on 9/11. But you have a professor down in Florida saying that he's a tenured professor who just said that African Americans are no more persecuted than white people. And there were calls for his ouster, but he has tenure. And I think it's Florida State University They said, no, we have to keep them because we believe in free speech. I don't see this cancel culture. I think bullies, and I think most of the people who signed that letter, who signed on to that letter at Harper's, like Barry Weiss and J.K. Rowling's, these people are accustomed to being scolds into a vacuum. And when people scold back, they, like bullies, they go, this is cancel culture. People are talking back to me. They don't like being talked back to. I think it's a bunch of bullies like David Brooks who don't like the idea that somebody's calling them on their privilege.
And these people, they have their platforms. They have the space to say what they want to say, and they're feeling threatened.
There are also, sports coaches and assistant coaches who've had to resign because some years ago they made a bigoted remark about a minority player. The papers are full of this sort of thing, Steve. There's a lot of that's going on, and some of it is 20, 30 years ago, and it's leading to the loss of the position, and people have to leave.
But there's also a consequence to free speech. Isn't that true too?
It depends who the speaker is. I mean, if the coach had power over these minority players and was engaging in bigoted remarks, you're right. But if it's just free speech by people who don't have power over the objects of their free speech, then you got to go back to Anthony Lewis's title, Freedom for the Thought We Hate.
Right. But there's the culture's way of saying that, you know what, this is no longer acceptable.
Well, I'll give you an example. For years, after 1948, when the State of Israel was established, it was almost taboo in this country to criticize Israel and Zionism. It was considered anti-Semitic, per se. Didn't matter what the facts were, didn't matter what the oppression of the Palestinians, didn't matter about our foreign aid going to Israel, military aid, it didn't matter. And then it started loosening up. It started at the campuses. Hey, there's another side to this question. Let's talk about this injustice and that injustice to the Palestinian people. So you see, now it's possible to have a discussion, a debate. So what's the response? Well, the response is to make people who have state contracts in some states lose their contract if they ever said anything favorable about the BDS movement against the Israeli domination of the Palestinians. Well, you see, that's in effect going from, well, we don't like what you say about BDS supporting it, but we're going to punish you. Then you get into the action area. And that in effect, is a stifling of the First Amendment.
Is that the culture or is that statute?
Statute in 3-4 states, I think.
Right. But we're talking about cancel culture. So, that's...
Well, here we go again. The word culture can be all-embracing, as anthropologists have often stated. It could include politics, law. They have law and anthropology, remember?
Right. I have a question for Ralph. It's going to be bothering me all week if I don't ask you this. Frank starts by talking about Ralph Nader and a life well lived. A life well lived. And when Mitch McConnell or Newt Gingrich or Frank Luntz, when they look back at their life, they're going to think they led a life well lived, won't they?
Yeah, everybody rationalizes their own performance. There's nothing strange about that. And what that reflects is that they are heeding a certain moral code. Gingrich and McConnell will talk about things they think were good for people, like protecting small business and allowing free markets and fighting the stifling hand of government bureaucratic regulation. So you notice that almost all plausible justifications for the worst politicians you can imagine have to find their root in some sort of broad moral code or principle of acceptance. Even dictators, the most brutal dictators, will try to hang in what they're doing into what they consider as a greater good for the fatherland.
Right.
And now Ralph answers more of your listener questions.
This question comes from Carol R. Brown. It's on the same topic, and she seems to be referring to an episode we did years ago with businessman Richard Master, who had the movie Fix It, which was a business argument for Medicare for All. And she says, thank you for the informative interview with Richard Master. I would like to know how hospitals that are also insurance companies, such as Kaiser Permanente in California, would transition to a single-payer healthcare system. Says, I did go to Richard Master's website. His fact did explain some of my questions. It states, in a publicly financed universal healthcare system, healthcare delivery is private, not government-owned, unquote. Only this does not totally explain how Kaiser as a corporation would transition to single-payer healthcare. I'm currently a Kaiser patient member, and most of my monthly fee is paid to Kaiser, which is a nonprofit corporation, and not to Medicare. And she says she's a longtime listener. Thank you also for your amazing advocacy on the support of the 99%.
Well, single payer means replacing private health insurance companies. So Kaiser would not be an insurer. It would be a vendor. It would have its hospitals provide services to people who are covered by government health insurance, full Medicare for all. So it would not be allowed to engage in health insurance activities.
All right, very good.
You explain vividly why private health insurance companies can't coexist in a Medicare for all scenario.
Because they would cream off the top, as insurance actuaries say. They would take the less vulnerable people, the healthier people, the younger people, and it would undermine the universal actuarial spreading of the risk that allows a public health insurance system to function at all. So they would be undermining it. They would be burrowing under it. They would be perforating it relentlessly with all kinds of maneuvers that would require lawsuits and government regulation to stop. Every Western country has universal health insurance, has to address that problem. It cannot provide the best actuarial coverage and predictability if it's pockmarked by opportunistic health insurance companies looking for the least risky aggregate of patients.
Right. And we have Democrats running on Medicare for all who insist that the system can't coexist with health insurance companies. They're coming across as adults when, in fact, they're lying to themselves and the voters. The idea that you can compromise as opposed to total war.
Well, the argument is, we're all covered by a public health insurance system, but if we want something really special, like our own personal doctor, full time, if you pay for it, you can get it. But you see, that begins undermining the system as well in terms of the allocation of medical expertise. That's why it's very hard to have a universal healthcare system with all kinds of ancillary private insurance systems going for market approaches and reaping the profits from the rich.
And the best example is education in America. The idea of offering elite schools to the American people, even in like charter schools, we see the result.
That's right. Charter schools are still public schools, but they're often privately managed by consultants or even corporations. And they also tend to take the least difficult students and leave the public school system with students with disabilities and students who have difficulties. And, after a while, you have a two-tier system that has great inequity to it. The charter school system has not been proven to educate the children better than public school systems in many studies. Once in a while, you'll see a study saying that that's the case, where there's very intensive investment in these students. But by and large, that's one reason why the charter school system is not spreading and isn't any more than 10% of the total public school student population.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we welcome back Dr. Michael Carome to tell us who we should be listening to about COVID-19. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way